Okay, wonderful. Of course, thank you to the organizers for encouraging me to write this paper. Today in this talk, I'm going to do two things. Much like Susan, I'm going to try and take a macro and a little bit of a micro perspective. And I'm going to start off with some grand macro thoughts about, well, what is different about how we think about privacy as economists in a world of AI. And that's actually the focus of the paper I wrote for the conference, and therefore will be the focus of Ginger's comments. And then I thought to just give us something a little bit specific to get into, I would go into detail about a specific example of some of the issues that are surrounding AI and privacy, which is new work from Alia Miller. So let us start off when we're thinking about privacy with some work by Howe back in 1996. And this is a really nice codification of how economists might think about privacy. And in this example, it emphasizes that I, as a consumer, will have preferences over, in this case, apples. And then what's going to be the big question is whether or not the seller of apples has information about my willingness to pay, and therefore the ability to extract all my surplus. Now, this starts off as quite a simple model, but it's incredibly useful because it allows us to think about some of the key issues in privacy. Right? You can imagine adding into this model different kinds of privacy protection, how that affects outcomes. We can also imagine using this model to analyze distortions in terms of how consumers may behave in trying to keep the information about their Apple preferences secret. Okay, so that's the general background, and my job is to look at this and say, well, is anything different about this model, which is a model of how we thought about privacy at the beginning of the internet, in a world of AI? And I decided there were perhaps three nuances or three new types of complexity that we might want to add to this model. The first kind of complexity comes from the fact that if you think about this model, there's no T subscript. There's some implication that all of this is happening somewhat instantaneously. But in a world of data persistence where data storage costs are so low, we may actually be using data that was created 30 years ago to inform us about a consumer's likely preferences right now. And that's going to add some dynamics into how we might want to think about this, about the privacy in AI. The next thing which is going to change is something I'm going to call data spillovers. If you notice in this model, there's almost a clear idea that the only players in this game are the firm and the consumer who's creating this data. But if you think about a lot of the technologies we're talking about, it's no longer clear it's really going to necessarily be the consumer that's creating this data. Imagine, for example, someone is going around taking photos, maybe chasing Pokemon in some kind of augmented reality world, and accidentally takes a photo. They're trying to catch a Pokemon, but they take a picture of me eating a certain kind of apple. Now, that data's been created, and it's not quite clear who controls or owns that data, and that adds another nuance to this model. The last thing I want to highlight is this idea of data repurposing. Now, Howe was nicely vague in the model, but I think the idea was that you went to look at apples or bought them in a supermarket or some kind of clear apple picking preference. But in the world of AI, we can have tens of thousands of X's, and it's very difficult to know which ones of those might be predictive of our actual Apple preferences. And so in a world of a lot of ambiguity over what data is actually going to be used, which again makes this idea of control and certainty, which is somewhat implied in the model, I think we need to have that nuance. Okay, so those are the big changes I see to how we might want to sort of add some nuances to our way of thinking about privacy in a world of AI and lower costs of prediction. In the paper, I discuss a little bit of my research, which may help us think about this. The first piece of research I highlight is actually of Avi, and it's a paper we wrote about how privacy preferences change over time. Now, one thing you often read in the popular press is this idea that millennials, or whatever we're calling young people these days, are somehow different and strange and just don't care about privacy. But what Avi and I show in this paper is, you know what? If when we were 18, we had had this amount of technology to take stupid pictures of ourselves doing stupid stuff, we would have done exactly the same thing, right? So in other words, 18-year-olds, it doesn't matter when they were born, are always a little bit more careless about privacy. And we tend to see a transition around the age of 28, 30 in how much people care about privacy. Now, this is going to be important for thinking about dynamics, because of course, if our preferences over privacy are evolving, but data can last forever, well, that's going to have implications about how we might think about it. Now, in terms of data spillovers, well, genetic data is an obvious example of where data about me can potentially tell you a lot about my family, or at least my blood relatives. But I do want to highlight just this idea that I think we've often thought about data in a privacy context in terms of it being binary. But in the future, data is not going to be like this, right? It's not going to just be binary. Instead, a lot of it is going to come from images, from augmented reality. And when you add to that facial recognition, then we're in a world where it's not very clear who's controlling this data. And this is going to emphasize some of the things we were talking about this morning when we were thinking about data ownership. Now, the last point about data repurposing, I thought, because that's a very big topic, I would just use a small example, which is coming from some very new work that I'm doing with Amalia Miller. And in this paper, what we're doing is we're saying, well, what happens when an algorithm uses data that was not intended for this purpose, but we can use to try and predict someone's ethnic background? And in particular, we're going to be asking, well, does this reflect any patterns of historical injustice that might make us feel somewhat uncomfortable? And so why am I sort of bringing this up? Because we were talking about privacy, and now I'm talking about algorithmic bias and racial discrimination. Well, this actually reflects a lot of how the privacy debate has shifted in Washington over the last 5 to 6 years. And a lot of privacy advocates always have this trouble articulating their position, simply because it's difficult to sort of say the privacy harm, right? If we're thinking about apples, the price you pay for them, that's not going to get a Congress member excited. On the other hand, if I tell stories about how someone's own data is being used to discriminate against them, that makes issues of privacy somewhat more actionable or also sexy or something like that. Now, in this literature, it's mainly sort of computer science, but there's been some popular books written in this sort of this space, linking together privacy and database discrimination. There are 3 main sort of culprits which are talked about. First culprit, the fact in the tech industry, all white males doing white male code. Bad things can happen. Second idea, well, they use historical training data. If bad things have happened in the past, we're going to replicate them. And the last sort of explanation is, gosh, people are still just bad. And then the algorithm's going to learn more bad things from us just being bad people. OK, so we're going to look at those, but we're actually going to put a sort of 4th option on the table about what's other ways we can see bias. And it's going to actually be exactly what Susan was talking about. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a field test on data. And the test is going to use we're going to have job ads, and we're going to target them at different ethnic affinities. And what we're going to find out is the algorithm that Facebook uses to predict whether you are of an ethnic affinity is going to be more likely to predict you as being an African American if you live in a state which had legalized slavery at the time of the Civil War. And, it's sort of a first order question in algorithms and discrimination, simply because I don't think there's really been a paper to show history show up in algorithmic decision makings in this way before. But it's going to be important for us sort of thinking about the distinction between econometrics and machine learning, because this is all going to happen because the person programming this wasn't thinking about the data generating process behind the X they were using to predict ethnic affinity. Okay, so let me tell you about this experiment in a little bit more detail. So I say it's a job ad. It was a nice job ad. It was highlighting a web page that gave information about something called the Federal Pathways Program, which is a federal program to try and increase the diversity in people having federal jobs. And what we're going to use is that Facebook gives us options to target by what it calls ethnic affinity. You will see, though, that they read, when you sort of look at them, African American, Asian American, Hispanic, they look much like race to me, right? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have 16 campaigns run in parallel over the course of a week. And we're going to target them at African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanics, and then the category of other, which is people who Facebook does not think of as in one of these buckets. And we're also going to have this separated out by gender and age. Why do we do this? Well, simply because the census gives us very nice and quite accurate predictions for how many people there really are of that racial background in that county for their age and gender profile. The other thing you'll notice is that we look at people between the ages of 20 and 29. And why is that? Well, it's all to do with just how many of those people are on Facebook, right? So we're sort of talking about over 99% take-up. So it's not the case that a lack of Facebook adoption is going to sort of explain everything we see. All right. Now, if you are of a legal background, you'll also already notice something slightly discomforting here, which is we actually have laws about this, right? And one sort of first order thing from taking about this paper is the ease with which the use of algorithms can allow you to get to places which feel very uncomfortable, given that as a society we generally thought it not something we want to do to either target or exclude on the basis of race. Okay, and I should say, Facebook, over a year ago, Facebook was actually challenged by the fact you could do this. And they said, we're going to put in a screen to say you can't do it. I know, we ran the experiment. The screen never happened to us. Anyway, so what do we find? So having said that, what do we find? This is an important graph to understand. It's the big result of the paper. And the main thing to understand is what the y-axis is telling you, which is the y-axis is the number of people, unique Facebook users, who saw the ad relative to the actual population in that county of that racial makeup and gender and age group as told by the census. All right. And then we're going to divide that up by different racial categories. And we're going to also then divide it up by whether or not the state had legalized slavery at the time of the beginning of the Civil War. And what you're going to see is these are quite sort of striking patterns in that we're going to see it in states where slavery had been legalized at the time of the Civil War, that the algorithm is going to think there's far more black people relative to the population living there than we might expect. And that this pattern is not replicated for any other racial group Okay, so that was the big result. We were sort of shocked at how big a result it is. I mean, if you look at that order of magnitude, we're sort of seeing a 3 times difference. Now, okay, so we then sort of thought, well, can we explain this with a bit of the economics of algorithms? Maybe it's the case that it's just somehow cheaper to advertise to people in these particular states of a particular ethnic background, but we didn't find that. And if anything, the economics don't explain this. They go the other way. It's actually more expensive to advertise to Black Americans in states which had a history of slavery. Okay, so what actually is driving this, and this is what I have to get to, we think there are 3 features of the algorithm driving this. The first feature is how Facebook predicts ethnic affinity. And so what they use, and I think this in Susan's language, a structured ML problem, is they use whether or not you like a kind of cultural content which they associated with an ethnic background. So backing out from the Facebook system, you are predicted to be African American if you like Rashida, who's a fashion model and celebrity. You're Hispanic if you like the singer, I've never heard of her, but apparently very, very popular singer in Spanish. And Asian American, best example I could find coming out of the data was whether or not you like this particular Filipino boxer. They use that to predict whether you're Asian American. Now, what's the problem here? So that's how they're doing it. Well, the problem is the difference between how poor and rich people behave on Facebook. Rich people, I'm going to say we, I think that's probably safe in this room. What do we do on Facebook? Well, what we do on Facebook is we like companies. The thing we like doing most is liking corporations. Then, we actually like journalists. Then we really like our banks. And we also like clothes. So I don't know what it says about rich people, but that's what we do on Facebook. On the other hand, what do poorer people do on Facebook? Well, for poorer people, they like their spirits. But importantly, look, they're using Facebook to express appreciation of movie characters, actors, actresses, singers. In fact, all the stuff that Facebook is using to predict whether or not you're from a particular ethnic background. Okay, so you've already got where this is going. We're taking out richer people. We're not going to be able to use this algorithm really to predict what they're doing. And the final fact you should know, which is I believe a large debate in economic history, but which is something that we just need to know the general data pattern about, which is that in general, if you're an African American living in an ex-slave state, then you tend to have a lower income. So we believe that in combination, this data generation process governing the X is what is leading to, for me, a pretty disquieting outcome. We do some extra stuff that I can talk about another time, but I just want to give you some sort of punchline here, which is that what we're doing here is, we're trying to document a case where an algorithm appears to be replicating some kind of historic injustice. And it's not about the economics of the advertising algorithm. Instead, it's coming from the fact the algorithm is using whether or not you like cultural stuff, by cultural being movies, music, on Facebook. The fact that that tends to be that's a tendency. Poor people tend to do that, rich people don't. And it tends to be people, African Americans tend to be poorer if they're living in an ex-slave state. So why is this important? Well, it's important because it's sort of I don't know, I would call it a victory for econometrics, but it certainly shows the importance of econometrics in that we have algorithmic bias happening for this reason, which might be predictable to any economist, but is becoming from the fact that whoever programmed this algorithm, I don't think was thinking about the data generating process behind that X and what it could be reflecting. And this matters Because if you think about it, let's suppose that for whatever reason, I wanted to exclude people of an African American background, then I'm more likely to behave in that exclusionary manner in states where there's been the most history of exclusion and injustice. And so that doesn't feel comfortable. Another sort of angle to this is, let's imagine I'm Hillary Clinton and wanting to reach African Americans in a sort of last minute get out the vote campaign. I'm going to reach African Americans in precisely the states where I did very well, relatively, and not reach them in the states where I do poorly. So we can sort of see some other consequences of this. Now, the last thing I just want to say is that, gosh, this for me emphasizes these issues of ownership and data ownership. It's not clear that when you like something on Facebook, write a message in Spanish, do any of these things, that you're aware it's being used to predict your ethnic affinity. And that's something we really haven't got in any of our models of economics of privacy. So with that, I'll say thank you. And I can't wait to hear what Ginger says.
I have to admit that I haven't published any paper in artificial intelligence or in privacy. But in the past 18 months, I was the chief economist at the Federal Trade Commission, which happens to be the leading government agency that police privacy and data security issue in the US. So that job forced me to think about privacy almost every day. So now that I'm back to academia, I really appreciate the opportunity to learn the cutting edge research done by Catherine and her co-author, and also continue to think about the policy issues. So I would like to, in the spirit of the conference, I would like to start with the big picture and then talking about details in Catherine's paper. Is there a clicker? Oh, okay, thank you. So the key question is, what is the problem, okay? In Variance world, we're talking about sort of an information asymmetry between a consumer and a supermarket. I want to buy Jonathan apple, but I have my private information of my willingness to pay, and the grocery store may use a lot of AI or other whatever algorithm to try to figure out my private information, and this information asymmetry is a problem. Note that this is not the only information asymmetry problem here, right? I mean, me as a consumer may want to know the private information from the firm about how fresh the apple is, how organic or how natural the apple is. So it could go both ways. And according to the classical economics literature, we know that reduction of information asymmetry often help in trade efficiency, okay? However, we seems quite worried about the consumer side of the problem. I think that's because our objective function is, say, consumer welfare, not firm profit. Okay? In that lens, we'll say, okay, we'd better to let consumers know every detail from the seller, but have the choice of holding private information from the seller or choose selected information to reveal to the seller. I completely agree with Catherine that the challenge of privacy issue is sort of beyond this focal transaction precisely because there are a lot of strings attached to it, right? It could be because the price would persist over time. The price may be repurposed by the firm after they collect my data, and the data could spill over to others. So because of those strings, it sort of exacerbates information asymmetry between the consumer and the firm using AI algorithms. And that is a concern of consumer protection. So far, I think the conference, including Catherine's paper, tried to focus on the intended use of AI, which is we have a bunch of acts. That list of acts may become longer and longer as we accumulate a lot of data, and we try to predict something, or why, right? The user of the data try to predict something, assuming there is something to predict about, that there's a stable type about you. In Catherine's paper is the asymptoticity of you. Okay, that's a fixed thing. It's a hidden thing from the firm, and the firm try to learn about it. However, in reality, we see there are a lot of unintended use of AI. which from the consumer protection point of view, probably I would argue is as important, if not more important. For example, instead of consumers have a fixed type, the consumers may not know his own type. Okay, I don't know whether I'm politically right or politically left. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the cues from the algorithm, and the algorithm will feed me some news article. I'm going to read that, and that's going to change my political slant over time. And then my use of news from the platform would feed back to the platform's algorithm. Okay, this starts to sound like information cascade, which we know could have some misleading outcome. Okay, another example is a week ago, Facebook company blog has reported that they have found evidence of shadow companies, likely operated from Russia, that has set up 470 fake accounts and purchased about 3,000 political ads. Okay, and maybe those users are not using any AI algorithm. However, the result of their activity is a function of how Facebook as a platform use AI algorithm to deliver those news to some people, right? So to some extent, this is indirect use of AI by somebody else who may not want, may be different from the initial data collector, okay? More generally, technical firms with AI, we talk about increasing return of data this morning. Every firm would have incentive to collect and store and keep as much data as possible, right? What does that mean? That means they are attractive target of hackers, okay? And the hackers would likely to attack them and steal the records and do something bad about the records. So in that sense, the AI use or the potential AI use of the data could generate some unintended consequence like this, which would come back to consumers as a potential harm. Also, it's at FTC, I happen to sort of run into a lot of creative fosters. And you can see that they're quite creative. They're probably not as sophisticated as using AI in Google or in Facebook or in Amazon, but the sheer volume of their activity, like in robocalls, it's just make you wonder, okay, how I'm going to counterintelligence the targeting of those robocalls. Maybe they're not very smart yet, but the phone number showing up on my phone is like having the first 6 digits exactly same as my cell phone number, right? So that kind of maybe low-level AI, but with large volume, could have significant and concrete consequence for consumers. So what I'm trying to say is, while we're all thinking about intended use of AI, how to improve that intended use of AI, there are a lot of unintended use of AI, which could be as important from the consumer protection point of view. Okay. Catherine has talked about quality of AI algorithm, and a lot of talks this morning has talked about how can we improve the precision of AI algorithm. And of course, if law enforcement agencies are using the whole database of law enforcement try to predict who is going to commit what crime tomorrow, I really want to make sure that they're having this prediction right, okay? So we care about the magnitude and the source of those bias. And research like Catherine's paper is really admirable, that I just wish more and more people are working in this area so that we truly understand there are bias in this and what's the source of that bias. We probably also want to ask a question, well, algorithm might be biased. Is it really more biased than humans not using AI but using some rule of thumb? I think that is a crucial question, and some research I have seen actually said no, but I would imagine that will be context dependent, and we really love to know more about that, okay? There's also a hypothesis that, okay, maybe the algorithm is biased today, but with more and better data in the future. We're going to correct that, okay? We're going to correct that in really fast speed, but in the previous example I have given you, if people's preference is fed by what you're giving them, by the algorithm, we may get into an information cascade problem, which does not imply that more data, less bias. Going to the other extreme, well, I also see people worry about, not because the algorithm is imperfect, they literally worry about consumers because the algorithm is too perfect, okay? If I know exactly, if Starbucks know exactly I'm willing to pay $100 for a cup of coffee in a very stressful morning, Starbucks may charge me $100. And then the typical response to that is, well, Dunkin' Donuts may learn about that as well and compete for my business, and then their incentive of competition will drive that down, right? And then you may say, wow, maybe Starbucks has so much data and that's an entry barrier, only Starbucks know that. However, in exactly this context, those who do not have precise information is the precise competitor that's going to prevent Starbucks from charging me that much. So I think that kind of thing probably tomorrow Hal and Carl would talk more about competition. Another worry about perfect algorithm is, wow, if one gasoline station have this algorithm, the other gasoline station have this algorithm, maybe they will engage in a perfect collusion, okay? And then they will get into a anti-competitive outcome. I think that so far is just a possibility, theoretical possibility, okay? So I'm running out of time. I just want to probably put this question up there. I think the key question is, should consumer give up privacy in order to gain benefits of AI, okay? The current approach is notice and choice, and we know the limit of that. There could also be that we push firms to be more transparent, or we have a direct regulation on what firms should do. I would encourage you all thinking about, out of those policy options, what are the pros and cons? Okay, I really have to stop.
Okay. Questions?
I wasn't exactly sure if the position you're taking is, I should just be worried that Facebook, allows me to advertise my club or my job service or, my hotel on an ethnically biased way, right, or a racially biased way. I might be worried about that. And then there's the second issue that apparently they do it fairly poorly, or or the algorithm doesn't work that well. And I guess I'm not. I mean, I understand about the correlation with historical associations, which is discomforting, but I'm not sure I should be happier if they. I mean, I'm not sure I should be happier if they did it well than that they're doing it poorly. And so I was just, hoping maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I want to build on that a little bit. I think there's a subtle. I don't think anyone's alleging that Facebook are intentionally discriminating. But the issue is that these algorithms can learn from data, and they may pick up biases in hiring or credit reports and other things. And particularly if the humans are biased, then that's going to creep in there. And I think it becomes more of an issue when most of the machine learning, the deep learning algorithms may have millions, hundreds of millions of parameters, so there's no way to explain. Unlike a traditional computer code where you can see the line where someone said, discriminate against blacks or whatever it was, this is going to have hundreds of millions of weights, none of which can really be interpreted by humans, but they collectively may lead to some outcome that we're concerned about. That said, I want to emphasize what I think Ginger said in her comments, that we have to remember humans are very biased. In fact, that's where a lot of these biases came from in the first place. Humans also confabulate and make up reasons that Danny Kahneman can, and they say why they're doing something that may be very different from when they're really doing it. And at least with the algorithms, there's the potential that you can test and improve and eliminate some of those biases over time. But I think there's and Jan can weigh in on this, I think there's a growing area of explainable AI to try to make it easier for us to understand what the AI is doing and what the outcomes are and why it chooses to make certain decisions so that it's not such a black box.
So I'm going to let Jan jump.
Okay, and I work at Facebook, so. Yeah, I mean, clearly it's very easy to make mistakes when you train a machine learning system and have it reflect the bias that's present in the data, and it's something that you have to correct for when you build those systems. If the humans are biased, I think Jason Furman, who is probably well known by many of you, said in a recent symposium at NYU that we need more AI because we have more chances of reducing bias in decisions made by machines than by people. I mean, there's all studies that shows that judges make harsher decisions of against convicts if their favorite football team lost the night before, or if it's just before lunch or late in the afternoon and they're tired. So we need, if anything, if that's the solution, we need more AI, not less, and that's his word, it's not mine. Now, what we need to develop, though, is not necessarily methods that make decisions explainable, because I don't believe that our decisions are particularly explainable either. We don't ask our taxi driver to explain how he or she drives a car, and the person in question has no way of explaining how the car is driven, because if there was a way of explaining how the car is driven, then we could actually turn this into computer code and we would have autonomous cars already. So there's a lot of things that are kind of at the subconscious level that we cannot explain, and those are the most complex decisions. So if we want our AI systems to make complex decisions, they're going to make complex decisions that are going to be very hard to interpret. And to some extent, we're going to be able to generate explanations for them. But I think what's more important is that bias is testable. And so what we should develop is techniques that remove bias in such a way we can test that those biases are removed. And that's relatively easy to do with statistical method, the testing. The removing the bias, that's not easy. It's still a topic of research, but I'm quite confident that some techniques will emerge that there are new techniques that are extremely recent, extremely new, that actually succeed in eliminating a particular type of information from a representation of a piece of data. So that could be something that could be used to remove bias. Now, about the systems that are used at Facebook, they are successful in one, in at least some of the metrics. For example, how long people spend looking at it. It's on the order of 15 minutes per day for the average Facebook user. A lot more for me. And so that's not the only metric, though. I mean, there's a lot more metrics that are used, and as Facebook progresses, more and more are being used that kind of have sort of a longer term value than just the immediate how much time people spend on Facebook. But there's certainly, as you said, there's no intentional bias or anything. Some bias sometimes kind of pops up and is fixed as it pops up.
Okay, so we still have 3 in the queue, and then I'll give Catherine a chance. So Tiff, then Carl, then Shane, and then Catherine can wrap up.
Thanks. Just let me say I enjoyed both the paper and the discussion. I wanted to come back a bit to this idea. There's a real trade-off in AI. On the one hand, there's some good reasons that you suggested why AI may make privacy issues more problematic. On the other hand, the flip side of it is having more open source data would allow for a lot more innovation and a lot more benefits from AI. So just to take your repurposing example, I mean, there seemed to be a bit of a bias in the discussion that repurposing is bad. It seems to me that the other, there are certainly some privacy elements, but the other side of it is a lot of the power of AI is it takes data from all sorts of formats in all sorts of places and combines it to create prediction engines that are hugely valuable in decision making. And if a privacy law were to say there's absolutely no repurposing, it seems like we would severely be limiting the innovation and productivity potential. So I'd like a little sort of comment on how do we think about that trade-off? Are there some principles when it's okay, when it's not okay? Thank you.
Well, my comment's very much along those same lines. There's a lot of discussion about bias, but I was thinking more just about kind of the notion that when all this information gets assembled, it's invasive and creepy, and people don't like it. But But on the other hand, it can, as you just said, it can unlock a lot of services. So that's not specific to AI, but it seems like it's going to be on steroids with AI. So, in a commercial context, we have one set of issues, which is sort of the trade-off you just described, actually. If the government's getting a hold of the data, then we have another whole set of other issues which could be worrisome. Of course, the Europeans are taking a very different view than the U.S. on this, and it also relates to how close, the security with which the data will be held. But I think this comes back to then, and maybe, Ginger obviously would be well placed to talk about this, Catherine too, what set of rules and, property rights are going to apply in terms of trading the data, who can use it, opt in, opt out. We've already been talking about this for a number of years, but I think it's going to become more important, and I just think we could have more focus and discussion on that. It's very hard to know what sort of menus of rights we'd like to have that would enable the open source sharing, but let people still have control over at least some of their data. I'd love to have great vacation planning if something could know what my previous vacations were and my budget, whatever. But I don't want people, but it could be creepy at some level, and of course I don't want the thieves to know I'm away on vacation.
Okay. Shane?
As usual, it's really great to hear your thoughts on privacy. Love your taxonomy of persistence, spillover, and repurposing. And sort of was trying to think through the implications for policies that forbid use of data. Because that's a very specific thing that many governments consider doing. Right? You see this in insurance markets, you see it in finance markets. And so would be interested to hear how you think about new information or new science or new knowledge making available data that was previously not available, and then changing what you can do with it. And in particular, this is happening in genetic data and there's all this stuff now using I can't even say the biological things, right? Just using data in each of our cells, and they're learning new things every year. And so it suggests, do you just ban all of that? But do you want to use it? How do you think through the principles of? You don't want a legislature revisiting that every year. But on the other hand, it just seems like that's a key question here.
Okay, so that's a lot to summarize in a minute or less, maybe? Maybe two, we'll give you two. Okay.
Thank you, okay. So I was really glad that everyone talked about the counterfactual in their questions. I mean, I was being intentionally provocative and showing you an example of an algorithm which looked discriminatory in ways that makes us feel uncomfortable, but then we also have to ask ourselves, what is the counterfactual? And it's not clear that if I went around, I guess, advertising in sports fishing magazines or something very white, I wouldn't really be doing exactly the same thing, which is the algorithm is doing. It's just that we can see it, and I think it happens in a way which has attracted the attention of policymakers. And then this brings us to the two questions, which is sort of like, well, what do we do? What are the really policy implications here? And I think I may disagree a little bit with Carl in his question, in that I think what I was trying to say is that, as economists, it's very natural to think about this in terms of data ownership, and this is some kind of failure in data ownership or control. But the way I was thinking about data persistence, this idea of data spillovers and data reuse, is it makes some of the property rights solutions that we naturally jump to as economists a little bit harder to implement. And that makes it hard for policymakers simply because our usual economic tools fall by the wayside, and then we're left with privacy advocates who generally their solution is more, let's ban all data. AI is scary, can be used for these instances. Let's just stop it before something bad happens. And so I think, I agree we need a policy solution. And I think our challenge is for great theorists is to think about ways of thinking about data ownership and control in a world where those boundaries have got fuzzy.
Okay. So Ginger, maybe comment while Dan's coming up to get his slides ready.
Yeah, I just want to make some comment about the policy tools. Definitely, I think policymakers try to strike a balance between allow consumers have their choice to express their preference about privacy versus all the potential future beneficial innovations. And that's a hard balance to strike. There are a range of policy tools here. I mean, I tend to think about this as an information problem rather than a property rights problem. And we have seen similar information problem before, right? In food safety, in drug safety, in aviation safety, and so forth. And I want to just emphasize there's some similarity there. There are also some differences there. So, for example, we all like better safety than less safety, everything else equal. But in terms of privacy outcome, there might be horizontal preference here. That's somebody want that information out while other people want that information in. So
Okay.
in face of that kind of horizontal preference, I think the choice set is harder to define.
Great.